What's up, guys? Back again, another video. It is Friday morning, heading to work right now for a pretty quick and easy day. Just doing some drywall finishing. But today, gonna talk about something that I think all sides of the political spectrum are sort of in conflict about right now. And there's a lot of conflict within each side, within each party, between sort of the establishment wing of the party and the more radical, typically younger, skewing side of the party. And this is sort of like a generational issue. It's very much a lot of political discourse right now, I think, on a wide variety of topics, comes down to, the boomer generation and to some extent Gen X sort of being on one side of issues and the younger generation, sometimes regardless of party, but sometimes the two parties being radically different, sort of conflicting with the older generations within their party. And so I've come up with this fun little name for this, which I'm going to call the Boomer Bootstrap Paradox. Unless you've literally never talked to a boomer in your life, you're probably familiar with the trope, which is the pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of advice, I guess you could generously call it. Or if you're being less generous, you could say the patronizing statement. But that sort of advice, has been a mainstay of especially conservatives in the boomer generation and the generation before them. But even with sort of the older leftists, which tend to be center leftists, you'll hear this as well. And the reason I'm calling it a paradox is because if you're of a younger generation, of a more radical skew, you may regard this statement as kind of hypocritical, to say the least. And so this video is kind of going to be addressing why that advice comes off as very condescending and also very hypocritical. So, I myself I would self-describe as a right-winger. That is not to say that I'm a conservative. These are distinct ideologies, in my opinion. What are we conserving? That would be my first question to a conservative, that I, would not agree with on a lot of things. So that's where the distinction lies. What are we conserving? But I am broadly a right-winger. And so firstly, I will sort of address that and then go through sort of putting myself in the shoes of young leftists who are advocating for more socialist policies, which in my opinion is where the boomers went wrong, is where their parents went wrong as well, is the lean into socialism. But we'll get to that. So to the so-called conservatives, the people that I'm sort of allied with at this point in my political journey, they'll often talk about this fiscal conservatism, Um, they'll make sort of general statements about, oh, well, we need to rein in government spending and we need to get the debt under control. And, oh, young people just don't work as hard and they don't have it as hard as we did. And, they'll also say things like, well, if young people just stopped spending all their money on these frivolous things and this and that, which in many cases I do agree with, personal fiscal austerity or the lack thereof does have a lot to do with the problems that millennials and Gen Zers are facing. A really easy reply to that I would just introduce, and I'm not going to talk too much about, but to all these problems, there is sort of this underlying reply of, but who taught them? Who raised them? Who didn't teach them personal finance adequately? Who, pushed them into this whole take on debt college, you must get a degree even if you don't have a plan for it? Who sort of pushed the younger generations into that paradigm, into that what I would call a trap? So that's sort of a really obvious but I think important and broadly applicable reply that I would have to many of these people in the older generations that are questioning the personal finances of some of these younger people. While I do agree, but who taught them? Who allowed them to? Who pushed them into the corral that is this, total indebtedness? Who created the system that, So that's sort of a general criticism. But so back to these sort of conservatives, these boomer cons, as I will henceforth call them. So they'll tell you all that. But then if I were to bring up something like Social Security or Medicaid, these big, gigantic, socialistic programs that are essentially safety nets that, we all pay into in order to gain some benefit later on in life, allegedly. A lot of those same conservatives will not touch that issue, are not interested in talking about that issue. They say, oh, I paid into this my whole life, and so I'm entitled to that money. The problem with that is largely twofold. The first problem with that is that Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. And so if you, being an elder in our society, were duped by a large-scale Ponzi scheme, and your answer to that is, well, I deserve the money, and where's the money coming from? Well, the younger generation's going to have to be forced by a decree of law to pay into this Ponzi scheme to get me out of it, even though as time goes on, the Ponzi scheme will continue to deteriorate. You're kind of asking the younger generation to pull up you by the bootstraps. It's kind of a problem, right? The other problem being, and it's related, obviously, we're still on Social Security here. So you paid in all this money over the term of your working life. Yup. Okay. We're on the same page. But at the same time, your generation voted for policies that put the country in so much debt that, in fact, you've spent more through government policy than you ever put in. And considering that most of these aging out of the workplace boomers are towards the end of their paying in, the term that they're paying in, they're at the end of their work life. So it's when they stop working, they're no longer going to be contributing. Then, so you're essentially saying, well, I deserve that money because you paid into something. But like, towards, if you were going to like court over something, like, some sort of, say, a divorce hearing or something, and you were like, well, I put all this money into the house, and so I'm entitled to the money that I put in the house. And then your spouse or their lawyer was like, yeah, but you also took out like $300,000 in debt. And so you've actually accumulated more debt than you've paid in and accumulated in assets. Are you going to get your money back, or is that asset going to be used to pay off a portion of your debt? How does that work? Now, add to the fact that the real messed up part, or one of the real messed up parts, aside from it being a Ponzi scheme that, forces people to put into it, and then by the devaluation of the dollar, you actually always get less out towards the end, but not getting into that at this second. But the other part of it, and it's the same exact thing with the debt, is like, so how would we look at it if a parent were to take out a credit card in their kid's name and rack up a bunch of debt and then like leave their kid with a bill? Well, we'd look at that like, wow, you're an awful parent and person, and that's like kind of unforgivable. And then to add insult to injury, that person were like looking at their kid who's going through like a bankruptcy hearing, although I know credit cards can't, yeah, I get it. But, just in this hypothetical here, it's like, and they were to tell their kid who's going through like financial strife because of this situation they put their kid in, and they were like, come on, kid, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We'd all be like, wow, dude, like, wow, that's evil. So that kind of is one of these sort of generational problems that our society is really like needs to deal with. We need to talk about it. We need to, if we're ever going to get out of the debt without the country like dissolving, which I think is a possibility, truthfully, myself. But that's like a real issue. Like, our parents, and I will say, not to put all the blame on the boomers, their parents too. The Social Security Act was FDR administration. So what, in the 30s? That was before all the boomers. So they're not the first generation to push their debt off to the next generation. And I don't want to act like they're the only one, but that is a really big problem. And to sort of not have the self-awareness that of your responsibility or your generations. Guys, I'm an individualist, so like, I'm not saying like, oh, there's generational guilt. Oh, let's collectively judge but we're speaking in broad terms here because this is a real thing. There are plenty of boomers, I'm sure, that for real, who are like, I don't want anything to do with Social Security. I don't want anything to do with Medicaid. I want to keep my money and invest it in my family, and I don't want to vote for all these big government policies. And so, of course, there are individuals, but we can't, ignore the problem by focusing on the exception to the rule. Also, like, we have to, we're talking in broad terms here. So this is like a real generational issue. And I think there's a lot of that going on right now. There's a lot of financial, economic, generational issues that if we're going to continue to exist as a society, not sure, but if we are, we're going to have to talk about this. We're going to have to deal with it. There's going to have to be broader understanding about how this works, how this has worked. What are the causes of the problems? So, to continue, another big cause of this problem, and completely related to my other two videos, which is a huge thing people are talking about right now, is the housing issue. Well, houses are unaffordable. New mortgages, the average age of a new mortgage person, the average age of a person getting a new mortgage is the highest it's ever been. Average age of of home buyers, highest it's ever been. These are all big problems. Like, younger people cannot afford to buy homes. That's causing them to put off big life decisions like moving to a new city or getting married or having kids or any of that stuff. It's all real deal life or death stuff, really. If you're thinking on long time horizons, this is like big deal issues. And this inflation of asset prices over time, of which housing is one category, that's due to the exact same phenomenon. That's due to government spending over the past 50 to 100 years. The more the government spends, the more it has to tax. At a certain point, very quickly, it can't tax all of it, so it starts borrowing. At a certain point, we're here. We have been here. But at a certain point, then you can't borrow anymore, and so you have to start inflating the currency, aka printing more money, aka devaluing the currency relative to goods and services, right? Like, if you have $1 trillion in circulation, and then the next day you have $2 trillion in circulation, things that costed $100,000 yesterday are going to cost $200,000 today, all else being the same. Obviously a exaggerated hypothetical, but that's how it works, right? Is like, if you print a bunch more money, you're devaluing the purchasing power of the current amount of currency. And you're only benefiting those who get the newly printed currency first, which is whoever's connected to the government, whoever's getting government contracts, politicians, whoever's in the loop. So, all that generation, not just the boomers, but the generation before them, voting for this increase in government spending over the decades is what has caused the rise in asset prices over time. And that's been like exponentially getting more and more problematic in recent years. Like, if you're a person who's been looking at real estate pre-COVID and after COVID and to today, you'll notice this incredible rise in asset prices and home prices. And if you look at the amount of currency in circulation, those charts are one and the same, up the same way, same. It's one phenomenon happening right there. And so all these policies that the older generations or the aging generations have voted for, that have created this gigantic government apparatus, all this government spending is what causes the assets to cost more over time. And the people who make the least, the employees, the people making close to minimum wage, they're the last people that are going to see the new money printed. Like the newly printed money, like first it's going to go to connected politicians and government contractors and receivers of grants, and then it trickles out to all their, all the companies that they deal with in their immediate circles. And eventually, after many changes of hands, it'll eventually get its way to the workers. But if you're, in the same sense, if you're making $20 an hour, and 10 years ago, that felt okay. We were like, yeah, we're okay. $20 an hour, not too bad, right? But then if 10 years later, there's twice as much currency in supply and you're still making $20 an hour, or even say you've worked really hard and you made your way up and now you're management and now you're $30 an hour. So let's do it that way. You made 20, now you're making 30, but over the same period, the amount of currency in circulation is doubled. Well, then you're actually making 3/4 as much as you used to, relative to how much you can purchase with that money. That's a problem. Government spending is the source of that problem. And the assets inflating is a necessary consequence of inflating the currency this way. And, these entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicaid and the social safety net and all of this government spending in general, writ large, that's what causes this phenomenon. And whoever's on the lowest end of the totem pole, the economic totem pole, they get screwed the worst. And also this happens because the people who owned houses at the beginning of this trend, right, they already own the asset. So even though they might be making less per dollar that they're earning over time, even adjusting for increase in wage rate, but they're already in the asset. They've already bought into the asset. And so they're reaping a benefit from the appreciation of that asset. So, they're kind of insulated from the consequence of this inflation, this government spending. And, that's one of the really devious things about Social Security also is so they're getting this benefit and the monetary conditions, the economic conditions were better early on in their life. So they had it better then. Then they're getting the appreciation of the assets that they were able to buy into at lower prices. And then also, Social Security is a transfer of wealth from younger people who make less, who have less assets. It's a transfer of wealth from them to the older, more wealthier generation who has more assets. That's a big problem. And over a long time scale, it creates gigantic problems. And just the underlying reality of having a inflationary monetary system, it encourages debt taking also, which, it's the people look at the debt as a separate and distinct phenomenon, but taking on debt is rational if the dollars are going to buy you less over time. Like, I kind of dipped into this just for a second when I was talking about 50-year mortgages, but it's like, everybody's like, oh, well, if you take on a 50-year mortgage, you're going to pay 3 times the cost of the house. You know, the listing price is $500K. You're going to end up paying $1.5 million for the house over the term of the loan. So that's the $500K principal and $1 million in interest. That's a lot of money, no doubt. But if the currency's inflated over 50 years and devalued, where at, you know, like on our current trajectory, a dollar might be worth today what $10 is worth in 50 years. And that's kind of a conservative estimate. So if you buy a house for $500,000 and you've got to pay over the term of the loan $1.5 million, but by that time the asset is appreciated to be worth $5 million, then you got a great deal by buying it for $1.5 million, even including the interest. So, you know, an inflationary monetary policy, which is what we have and what we've had since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, encourages debt taking this way. And you've got to wonder if the representatives in the government, I don't think they do, because I think they're kind of dumb and unimpressive people, but you kind of do have to wonder, do they understand this phenomenon? And are they just like, oh, well, we can spend the money because we're going to devalue the currency, and then like it won't really seem like that much money later on? Maybe. I don't know. But either way, they're writing, you know, they're taking out loans in their kids' and their grandkids' names. And that is wrong and immoral and unethical. So I'm going to wrap the video up a little different than I thought I was going to. I thought I was going to get into more, but I spent a lot of time on sort of like asset appreciation and why that happens. But I want to further explore this concept as we go along, because I see this being like a big generational divide over the next like 10 years. And then eventually the boomers are going to kind of fall out of political power as like a big voting block, you know, over the next 10, 20 years. That's going to happen just by, unless we invent immortality or something. So, you know, I think this is kind of like a thing that we should, if you're politically involved, I think this is something we should really be talking about. And I know there's this big like left versus right divide, and truthfully feels like that's probably going to continue and maybe get more radical over time. But we should maybe consider that, I think we should consider that a lot of this cultural divide stuff could be alleviated if economic situations for younger generations were better. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be focusing on with this channel. You know, I've got a lot of opinions about foreign policy, about culture issues, but you know, there's other people to listen to for that. Especially like foreign policy, like there's better people to listen to than me. Like, and also I think in the younger generation, there's already consensus has been reached. So I don't really feel the need to focus on it that much. So I'm going to stick to this economic stuff because I think that is the actual key to alleviating some of the pressure cooker effect of these cultural issues. If everybody was doing it better economically, I think a lot of this other stuff would not matter as much. So let me know what you guys think. That's the video for today. I'll probably take this weekend off and be back next week. and we'll find something else to talk about. All right, later.